Using a truncated syllogism to create a thesis statement for expository and research compositions. So this presentation is going to go over the construction of a thesis statement both sequentially and structurally, but additionally, it's going to demonstrate how the use of a tool known as a truncated syllogism can also help you polish off and construct strong thesis statements. Okay. So one of the most important elements when you're writing a thesis statement is that your thesis statement needs to be defensible. So what do we mean by a defensible statement? So many students actually write thesis statements. They write their claims, right? Remember, in the claim, it has to be argumentative. But they write these claims that are not really argumentative, right? Rather than be argumentative, they're either factual or they're descriptive or informational. And and I and maybe the perspective or the understanding of students is that, look, I want my reader to agree with me. I want the reader to not disagree with me. But remember, an expository composition, whether it be a research paper or a rhetorical essay or an argumentative essay, I mean, whatever the composition is, you're proposing a claim. You're proposing something um, in order to try to persuade a reader. And if you're stating something factual or informational or descriptive, then your propositions are really not persuasive. Why not? Well, because they are what they are, and most readers are generally going to say, okay, I agree. I agree. Oh, I see that description. Okay. You know, Instead, you have to keep in mind that your thesis needs to be defensible. It has to be a statement that has an oppositional or a countering position. Okay, so let's take a look at the structure. And this is just the beginning of the structure. Okay, so every thesis statement, undoubtedly, every thesis statement has both a subject and a point. So here's an example. Subject, euthanasia. Point is unjust. So so now we can ask ourselves, okay, I've taken my subject, I've clearly taken a subject, and I've made a point about that subject. Now, is this point defensible? And of course, euthanasia nationwide is an act that not all states agree with, but it's also an act that some states do agree with. So you see that the the defensible position is certainly noted there. Okay. So in addition, this is and again, I would argue that this is just the starting point of a thesis, because I think when you construct a thesis, your thesis should also implicitly or explicitly demonstrate a line of reasoning. So what do we mean by a line of reasoning? So let's take a look at the structure here. Again, you're taking a subject, you're making a point about that subject, and now structurally you're adding a line of reasoning. So a line of reasoning is basically giving insight to the reader as to what the rest of your essay is going to talk about. So in other words, here's the subject and point: euthanasia is unjust. Now the rest of this thesis should acknowledge the supporting reasoning as to why or how euthanasia is unjust. So let's read this thesis. Euthanasia is unjust given it is an act of murder and imposes itself upon the mentally unstable. Okay, so my point is that euthanasia is unjust. However, um, we can't just leave it at that, right? We can't just leave it at that. We want to, it's kind of like a pre-outline, or in essence an embedded outline for what the rest of your essay is going to be about. So you're arguing that it's unjust, but you're also demonstrating to the reader the reasons why it's unjust. This act of murder and an imposition upon the mentally unstable. All right, once you write your thesis, remember again, you're making a point, it's defensible, and you have a line of reasoning. So you got to make sure that you have those three elements. Um, and ask yourself, is it defensible? Is this something that has a countering position? Again, because if your thesis is not defensible, if it's not argumentative, if it doesn't have a countering position, then then you don't really have an argumentative draft, right? You're not in essence composing something that's looking to persuade. You're just either informing or describing or stating facts per se, which are not necessarily bad things, but just not for the types of drafts that we're interested in writing. Okay, so these are just some common elements of writing a thesis statement. So I'm going to suggest the application of a tool called a syllogism. Now, a syllogism is a structure that was developed by Aristotle to apply what's known as logical reasoning, right? Meaning you're demonstrating a good process, right? A sequential process that's allowing you to analyze and understand the way in which you're arriving at a particular conclusion, a particular claim. So, what's a syllogism? It's a logical sequence of premises and a conclusion. So, premises are those statements that support a conclusion. Now, let's think about the thesis statement we just looked at a little while ago, that euthanasia is unjust because it's an act of murder and imposes itself on the mentally unstable. Your premises here would be your line of reasoning. These are the supporting features for that conclusion that euthanasia is unjust, or whatever argument you're applying. So again, your premises are helping you establish your line of reasoning. Okay. And the conclusion, of course, is going to be that particular claim that you're trying to convey. It's the thesis, the claim the author is conveying. And in essence, it's the statement that's supported by the premises. Okay. So let's take a look at an example. Okay. So it's the same thesis. We're just gonna look at it now as written in the form of in the syllogistic structure. So we always want to begin, not always, but I think it's a good idea to begin with the conclusion first. So here's the statement: euthanasia is unjust. So there's a very specific particular point. Now I'm going to apply my first premise, and again, my premises are applying what's known as this line of reasoning. So why is euthanasia unjust? Well, here's premise one: taking the life of an innocent person is unjust. Premise number two: applying a medical procedure on individuals who are mentally unstable is unjust. Okay, so I've got the two key points that are in essence supporting or looking to support that euthanasia is unjust. But I'm going to add a third premise. And now this third premise that I'm going to add is going to validate those two premises towards my conclusion. So again, if we look at premise one, taking the life of an innocent person is unjust, and applying a medical procedure on individuals who are mentally stable is unjust. So a third premise is that euthanasia takes the life of innocent people and applies itself upon the mentally unstable. Okay, so now I'm validating here that euthanasia is indeed an act that applies both of the premises I just stated. So therefore, noting that euthanasia applies both of these acts would therefore make euthanasia unjust. Okay, so traditionally, a syllogism includes premises that are true. Um, but remember, we don't want to state facts, right? Why don't we want to state facts? Because we're not writing informational drafts. We're not writing drafts that are just giving you information. We're not writing drafts that are just providing you with a description of something, right? Our purpose is to be convincing. We're aiming to get to a truth, even if we don't particularly know the truth, right? We're arguing a position. So even though a syllogism has premises that are true, you notice that the premises we looked at may not necessarily be true in this case. And guess what? That's okay, right? So this is what we mean by a truncated syllogism, also known as an enthymeme. It means that at least one of the premises leading to the conclusion is simply assumed. So it's not absolutely true. It's assumed to be true. So let's look structurally. Let's take a look. All right. So in the example I provided you, you notice I noted that the first premise, I put a question mark. Is it true? Right? Taking the life of an innocent person is unjust. So we'll look at that in a little bit. So I put a little question mark on whether or not that's true. The second one, imposing ourselves on the mentally unstable is also unjust. Is that also true? Then another premise is a type of validation, and the conclusion is validated. Now, a syllogism is generally a three-statement argument. So this one has one more, but I'm applying that validation just to try to show you the reasoning process towards getting to our conclusion. So let's evaluate those premises we were looking at. Taking an innocent life is unjust. Is this premise true? And one of the considerations I brought about is that, what about a life that is suffering? If you see somebody that's suffering, is it necessarily or particularly unjust to take their life? If we're not in their shoes, we don't know what pain and suffering they're undergoing. So, uh, is it necessarily unjust for us to take their lives, right? To apply euthanasia. So you see how it's already in a sense controversial, and there's a little, not a little, but there's certainly a sense of an argument applied there. Okay. The second premise, right, where we're of imposing an act on the mentally unstable is unjust. This one, sort of a person, is this true? If a person does not have a sense of agency, meaning if somebody's so ill that they cannot act in and of themselves, is it necessarily unjust that we impose this act on them? Maybe they told us very, very subtly, then they said, or not subtly, but very tentatively, they said, I don't want to live anymore. Help me end this suffering. I've got a terminally ill disease and I can barely move. Can you help me with that? So, but we know they're mentally unstable because of this health condition. So with this, their inability to apply agency, would this be, um, is this true? Right? Is it necessarily unjust? So you notice that even both of these premises are essentially questionable, right? So is euthanasia unjust if applied on a suffering individual, even one with an unstable mind? So now we have the makings of a good argument, right? Do all the premises validate the conclusion? We want to at least suggest that a validation is applied, right? So structurally, again, as long as we have one questionable premise, and not all premises are particularly true, then we've got our makings of a good argument. And remember, we're getting to the truth, but we're not stating facts, right? We're making a defensive statement. A thesis, in essence, is not a fact, it's an argument. Okay, so I hope this helps you.